Within community and society, there are few groups that influence our life more than the family and household we grew up in. This is even more true for historical times, when more things happened inside the domestic group or household. Sharing the same living space most often coincided with sharing the same occupation, the same resources, the same beliefs. Living together meant working together, struggling for a common future, passing on wealth, name, values, and education. What happened inside the household both influenced what happened in the rest of society, and was influenced by society. In short, the household lied at the intersection of the most important human interactions. For this reason, the study of family and household life is an important part of understanding how societies evolved. However, this research topic is often marked by ambiguities, even when asking the most basic of questions, like, who were the individuals and families that shared the same household? What was the structure of households in the past? This presentation will focus on a Romanian context and will show that these questions still need an answer. So, how did the Romanian household look like? Much of what we find in scientific literature about the Romanian household in historical times originated in interwar fieldworks of the sociologic school led by Dimitri Gusti. The most influential paradigm is that established by Henri Stahl, later popularized by his son and follower, Paul-Henri Stahl. According to this paradigm, households were mostly simple because they formed at marriage. Upon getting married, couples would immediately move into their own home and were endowed by their parents. A partible system of inheritance existed, recognized both by sociologists and historians. The only exception was made in the case of the youngest son. In exchange for the parental house and the last remaining wealth, he would care for his parents until their passing. If time called, he would also get married and continue his life in the house he grew up in. If the family had no son, then the son-in-law would take his place. In the broader field of historical household studies, using the terms coined by Frederick Laplace, we would characterize the Romanian household as a stem family. Its formation and evolution were a combination of neolocality and patrilocality, amid partible inheritance. Being at the forefront of this field, Henri Stahl's research had inevitable shortcomings. Most importantly, his main theory is based on a very small population. Just that from village marriage, 537 households. Such a limitation is not unique to Romanian academia. In fact, household studies have several paradigms based on extremely small samples. This applies to some of the biggest names in the field, such as Frederick Laplace and Peter Laslett. However, Western academia gradually expanded to more larger samples as the field of historical demography grew. Thus, historical demography replaced sociology in the study of households in historical times. In Romania, this started taking place in very recent years. Practically, the Romanian field of household studies is only now starting to develop a historical alternative to the sociological paradigm. The absence of this field meant that for decades, researchers interested in Romanian households turned to Romanian sociology instead of history. A good example is that of Maria Todorova. In her book about families in the Balkans, among other topics, she compares types of households from various spaces and centuries. Romania or the Romanian principalities are absent from this picture because Romanian research of this type was so scarce. Instead, Maria Todorova only cites Paul Stahl's work. Inevitably, the sociologic theory was overgeneralized and was projected to apply on past centuries as well. Moreover, since sociology was strongly linked to ethnography, the sociologic concept of the household also became a cultural symbol. Just like traditional houses became national icons, the traditional household became to be seen as a national trait. The Romanian single-family household distinguished Romanians from neighboring Slavs and Hungarians, who were seen as dominated by complex households. Again, such gross generalizations are not unique to Romanian academia. For example, the same dichotomy can also be found in German sociology, in regard to Germans and Slavs. The difference is that in Romanian academia, such comparisons went unchallenged for a longer period. The implications of the sociological theory do not stop here. The inner mechanisms of the household were inherently linked to rural society as a whole. According to Henri Stahl, the Romanian village in historical times had strong communal ties. All aspects of life, from socialization to agrarian economy, involved the participation of the entire community. Often it was implied that planning, working and establishing local institutions, as well as land ownership, all were performed collectively. More or less directly, this communal trait was used to explain why Romanian households were simple. To paraphrase, households did not have individual economic needs or workloads. The entire village acted like a household, so there was no need for individual complex households. Even though Henri Stahl thought the communal village existed far before the simple households he observed on the field, there were scholars who practically linked the two realities in one theory. Such is the case of Daniel Shiro. To conclude so far, the composition of Romanian rural households in historical times has been imagined through the lens of interwar sociology. This raises the fundamental question: how safe is it to apply field observations to past centuries? Furthermore, we should also address important shortcomings of this field, particularly the lack of statistics. Today, one way to overcome this knowledge gap is through historical demography. To get a more accurate image of how households were structured, we can use old population records. We can digitize them and analyze the resulting data through various methods. We can classify households in detail, and we can classify individuals according to their role inside the household. We can perform a life course analysis to see how households evolved. Lastly, we can look at the interplay between demography and economy to better understand inner mechanisms such as inheritance practices, economic strategies, and constraints. We can engage in this approach using the population forms from the first modern Romanian census. Wallachia was a principality that expanded in what is now the south of Romania. In 1838, it had its first general recording of the population. Thankfully, most of the population forms survived, preserved in the state archives. Only a small part was published, first in traditional format, or books. Recently, digital material has started to be released as harmonized datasets representing population samples. The first sample was published in 2015 in the Mosaic database. Initiated by the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research in Germany, this platform focuses on Central and Eastern Europe. The Wallachian sample is representative and covers over 21,000 individuals. In 2021, the History Institute of the Romanian Academy launched its own database, called DemEast. The initial releases are part of the same census. On the website, users can learn more about the source, about its chronology, types of forms, chain of command, and preserved material. The available samples were constructed as datasets with information on individual level. Moreover, the historical information was harmonized, thus making it ready for scientific use. Each sample covers an entire circumscription and can be downloaded freely. The only condition is that they are cited in published works. General information and interactive maps are available for each circumscription, including archival and administrative references. In addition, users can go through an exemplified documentation of the digitization process. This platform was launched with 2 samples from the 1838 census. The sampling was made in such a way that it would respect the integrity of the circumscriptions, respect environmental diversity, gather information that was of relatively good quality. We sought material that was better compiled by the census takers. Following these principles, 2 census books were chosen. One covers the population from a mountainous area, and one from the plain, bordering the Danube. In the next segments, we will take both samples, analyze them, and see how households were structured, from the shores of the Danube to the foothills of the Carpathians. But first, what sort of information do we find in this census? Censuses of the age usually recorded only taxpayers, who were usually men. The census of 1838 expanded its scope to non-taxpayers as well, regardless of gender and age. All individuals had to be recorded by name and grouped by house. Therefore, in this census, the domestic group or household is defined by the group of persons inhabiting the same house. Their status is also mentioned, regardless of blood relation. In this case, a non-relative is living with the householder's family. Other recorded information included age, marital status, ethnicity, fiscal status, property status, occupation, disabilities, as well as a whole range of data on agrarian economy. For each farmer, we have a count of the plots he used, by category, like in this example. Fruit trees and vineyard were recorded separately. We have the sum of large livestock, horses, oxen, cows, buffalo, donkeys and mules. Small livestock were also covered, sheep, goats and pigs. Finally, we have the number of beehives. Given this richness of information, the 1838 census forms are suited for a great range of research topics. In a Romanian context, it is one of the few sources that allow the study of household patterns, and one of the best sources to study rural society as a whole. Most importantly, whatever the topic, it allows us to closely study the interplay between demography and economy. Even by Western standards, it is one of the few general censuses that brings together both social information and economical information. So, how does the household appear in this source? Let's first look at the highlands. Most households, around 3/4, were simple. They were composed of a single nuclear family. This result did not come as a surprise. Contrary to ethnographic projections, at that time households were simple in most European countries. Rather, what is unusual is the very weak presence of multiple family households. They barely register in our results, representing only 4% of the total. This is one of the smallest percentages in the whole of Europe. Extended family households were more numerous, roughly 1/5 of the total. Are these the types of households that Henri Stahl observed? The majority of simple households might seem to fit the theory. However, when examining further, applying life course analysis, we find that the answer is much more nuanced. What seems to be missing from our results is the phase where the youngest son married inside the parental household. In this sample, separation between parents and children into different households seems almost universal. When we look at the youngest families, we find that the vast majority lived alone or with other relatives. On the opposite end, the vast majority of the elderly also lived alone. It is only in extreme circumstances that we find parents cohabitating with married children. Usually, when they were very old and widowed. This suggests that parents could have rejoined their offspring in their old age, after an initial separation. Peter Laslett called this nuclear reincorporation. This concept was not approached by Romanian sociology, but it seems to have applied to this historical population. But even in this stage of life, cohabitation was not a rule, as only a minority of the elderly lived with a younger generation. To conclude, the household in the Highlands was even more simple than postulated, according to our analysis of the 1838 sample. Even the youngest son would have departed upon marriage, and a multi-generational household did not form except for few cases. Meanwhile, something different can be observed in the lowlands. Here, residential bond between generations seems far stronger. When we look at the youngest families, we find that the majority lived with their parents. This also applies to half of family heads aged 20 to 24. Moreover, in 40% of such households, we find a younger brother living alongside his parents and married brother. This clearly contradicts the idea that only the youngest son lived in the parental house after marriage. On the contrary, other children would move into their own house when getting married. Eventually, the initial co-resident families could also have moved. It is also possible that, eventually, the youngest son could have remained, but only after more complex stages of living, as shown. What is certain is that a great part of the elderly lived in such households, far more than in the Highlands. To conclude, we find multiple household patterns present in the lowlands. At young age, we find a mixture of neolocality and patrilocality, with or without the family of the youngest son. At old age, we also find a mixture of living alone and living with the younger generation. The outcome of these different patterns is that households in the plains were more complex. While in both cases most households were composed of a single family, the share of multiple family households was visibly greater in the lowlands. This raises the question, why? Among other issues, the search for an answer can address the idea of the communal village. Were households in the highlands more simple because the whole village was like one big household? Following this path means an entire separate research, through multiple types of sources. So far, we could only explore contextual elements that were available directly in the census. Namely, household economics. So, from an economic point of view, how did the two regions compare? Looking at how wealth was distributed per population, we find that households in the plains handled more resources than those in the highlands. Predictably, they farmed more land, as more arable land was available. As a consequence, they used more large livestock, especially for plow and transport. When it comes to pasture livestock, like sheep and goats, we often associate them with alpine pastures and mountainous regions. However, most 19th century sources, including this census, show that such livestock were slightly more present in the plains, when adjusted per population. The only resource where highland households held an advantage were fruit trees. Plum trees were grown widely, as plums were used to make hard liquors. Overall, it is easy to observe that lowlands households were more active in terms of agriculture. We believe that this put certain pressure on the family. First, it created more labor demand. Second, it discouraged the division of the family wealth. Both factors could have led to joint management of resources between different families, in the same household and in certain stages of life. By further analyzing complex households, we can better understand how crop agriculture influenced social relations. Various dynamics existed between the older and younger generation. If we look at multiple family households where the father was in his 50s, we can see that the older generation had a clear authority. First of all, they held the headship of the household. Second, from an economic stand, they were the owners of the most important assets, large livestock. This probably means that in this phase, married children who lived with their parents had not received their rightful dowry. We assume this because the number of work cattle was used by regulators and estate owners to distribute land to each family. Therefore, the lack of work cattle signifies the lack of means to establish a household. Hence, the absence of work cattle meant the absence of a proper dowry. We believe that parents postponed endowment because they tried to avoid both the division of assets and the departure of labor force from the household. There was economic incentive to do so, but there was also another concern. In this early phase, the original family still had unmarried children, who represented future brides and grooms, to endow. For the parents, losing wealth at this stage meant fewer possibilities to accumulate dowry for future families. It was only when these pressures faded that parents could pass on their remaining wealth and authority. When we look at more advanced age groups, we see that the roles inside the household were inversed. The younger generation held both authority and ownership over the most important assets. Still, there were far more arrangements of this kind than in the mountains. This shows that living together and sharing assets was more important in the plains. Why? In the mountains, we believe that these pressures were not felt as much. Parents had less to offer to their children, while having less need for their workforce. Arable land was very limited, and at the same time, tree growth, an important source of income, did not require livestock or a large labor force. Hence, customs and inheritance practices could act more freely, leading to separation into different houses. Whatever the explanation, the 1838 census opens new hypotheses and perspectives on the knowledge about rural households in the past. It shows how living together differed from highlands to lowlands, and the possible mechanisms behind every pattern. In the mountains, we can indeed see some of the most simple households in Europe. even more simple than previously thought, made so by a combination of inheritance practices and other customs. If the communal village can also provide an explanation for this, it remains to be revealed by future research. On the other hand, in the plains, residential groups were more complex than thought. Kin ties were stronger, living together was more frequent, usually under the authority of the parents. In other words, household relations were more patriarchal. This contradicts both the sociological theory regarding households and the idea of endowment occurring at marriage. It appears that practices were more flexible and dictated not by customs, but by economic needs.